Welcome to Making Space. It's our Bayview Community Podcast where we want to make space to encounter God, we want to make space to enter into each other's stories, and make space to engage God in His mission here. And so today on this podcast, we have Pastor Dave with us, and we also have Pastor Ken Shigematsu from 10th Avenue Church in Vancouver joining us today. Pastor Ken has just walked with us through this series on survival habits of the soul, and we had a chance to sit down with him, and just be able to pick his brain about what's going on, how he's doing, how he came about writing these two books that he's written, one called God in My Everything and the other called Survival Habits of the Soul, and some of his thinking behind these spiritual practices and disciplines that we're incorporating into our life. So, Pastor Ken, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike and Dave. It's really great to be with you and with your community again.
Yeah, so Pastor Ken, tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us a bit about your story, maybe how you came to Christ, how you entered ministry. What were you doing before? I know you touched on it a bit during our sermon series. So, I'm just going to open it up with that. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I was born in Tokyo, Japan, and when I was about 2 years old, our family moved briefly to London, England, and then eventually to Vancouver when I was about 8. And when I was a teenager, I was getting into some trouble. I was shoplifting. I was getting into fights at school, joyriding, doing some small-time drug dealing. And my dad, who was this very conservative Asian man, was concerned about me. So he took me on a little field trip to one of the local prisons and afterwards simply said, I just wanted you to see your future home, courtesy of my tax dollars. Well, that didn't scare me straight. And so my dad, who had been raised as a nominal Buddhist in Japan, had recently started to follow Jesus. And he took me to a youth conference, and I heard about this offer that Jesus was making to forgive my sins and give me a fresh start. And I knew that I was heading in the wrong direction. And so I gave my life to Christ as a teenager, and I slowly began to change. And then maybe a year or two afterwards, I was 16 years old or so, and I was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. I thought I might pursue just a standard career in business. And I went to a summer camp. And the speaker was an evangelist from Argentina named Luis Palau, who passed away this past March. And I was in a youth group at the camp. But one day the ski boat broke down. We were supposed to go water skiing. And so all the youth had to go listen to Luis Palau. And he spoke passionately about his vision to reach Latin America and parts of North America with the gospel. And I was very inspired. There was no altar call. But I remember going to our little lodge and getting down on my knees and saying, God, if you want to use me in your harvest fields in sort of a full-time way, I don't think I used that exact language, I'm available. And so that was a turning point for me as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Dave,
Yeah. So, Ken, we talked a little bit about this before when we were off camera, just regarding our connection, how I actually taught and worked with your sister when I lived in Quebec. So it's kind of cool to actually meet the older brother that she so admired and talked about all the time. So it's great having you here. So I'm really curious when it comes to your story. I'm actually, how did your dad decide to start following Jesus? Because what I've always understood about Japan is that it's been a little bit antagonistic or closed off to the gospel and Christianity. So how did your dad actually come to know Christ?
Yeah, my dad was a young boy as the war in Japan ended, and Japan at that time was impoverished, decimated by the war. He met some missionaries from North America, from Canada and the US, who were very kind and really manifest the love of Christ. Again, he probably wouldn't have used those words at the time. And then eventually we moved to England, and he thought it would be the British thing to do to go to church. So we started going to a Presbyterian church, and then did the same when we moved to Vancouver. And for a long time, my dad described himself as someone who was seated, by a swimming pool and dipping his toe into the waters of Christianity, but hadn't actually jumped in. And then he went to a men's retreat that was sponsored by his church. And there was some guy who, I can't remember the details of his actual work, but he was a fighter pilot. I think he might have actually served a tour of duty in Japan during the war. And he spoke about his conversion. And my dad realized that while he intellectually believed in God, he didn't know Jesus personally. And so he made a decision to dive into the waters of Christ, and it began to change his life. And so that was how his journey unfolded.
Yeah, wow, that's really neat. And so as you were, growing up and starting to understand what it meant for Jesus, or meant to follow Jesus, I mean, you've written these 2 books that talk about, rhythms and spiritual practices and all that kind of stuff. Did he have any particular practices when it came to Christianity and faith that I guess influenced you, that you observed growing up as a boy?
Yeah, one of the things that he practiced after he really met Christ was tithing, giving the first tenth of his income to the work of God. Prior to that, when we would go to church, he would say he would reach into his pocket and maybe pull out some coins or maybe a few small bills, put them in the basket as it would go by. But as he began to tithe, he noticed that God provided all that we needed, and sometimes just a little bit more. So, for example, we had 5 kids in our family, which is a very big family by Japanese standards. And we were living in this house in North Surrey, a suburb of Vancouver. And we didn't have the money to complete the basement into a kind of living area. And after he began tithing, a neighbor of ours dropped by and said, I see that your family is growing, the kids are getting bigger, and you should really finish off your basement. I've got all this lumber from a previous project. He was a plumber. I'm not going to charge you for it, or I'm going to charge you my cost, and I won't charge you for my labor. And he completed the basement for us. And another time when he was given an opportunity to support Luis Palau's ministry in different countries of the world. It was a sacrifice. I can't remember exactly what he gave. I never knew, but after he gave that money, he received a promotion at the CBC, where he went from being a part-time journalist to being a full-time journalist. And there were just a lot of really specific ways in which God provided. And so that impacted me. And with my writings, I take no royalties. The contracts are set up with HarperCollins Christian Publishing such that all the royalties and proceeds go to a fund that supports missions that work with vulnerable children like World Vision. And I've got a daytime job, so this is not sacrificial. This is nothing noble. But I think that part of the reason I'm inclined to do this is because of my dad's practice of tithing and giving generously and seeing God provide.
Oh man, that's great. That's an amazing story. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, no, that's a good testimony of just God's faithfulness and so yeah, I think that's pretty awesome. You mentioned that you wrote a couple books with HarperCollins, right? And so we have one of them with us today. It's called God in My Everything. I think that was the first book you wrote. Am I right? And your second one came out a few years ago called Survival Habits of the Soul. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Awesome. And just one of the questions I had, I guess, behind some of those things was, what kind of led you to write these books? What kind of led you to, was there, was that spiritual practice side always a part of your practice as a Christian, or was it something that you kind of had to learn over time? Was it something that there was something that just needed to happen in terms of God breaking through? And just what was going on behind the scenes, I guess.
Yeah, I was working in the corporate world, as I mentioned to the Bayview Glen community in one of the sermons, and it was pretty crazy. I was what they called a 7-Eleven man in Japan, which meant that my workday went from 7 in the morning till just past 11 at night, and so things were pretty crazy. And eventually, I returned to Canada, became a pastor here in Vancouver, and I found myself keeping almost the same hours. I felt like I was constantly treading water. And right around this time, my mentor, whom I also mentioned in one of the sermons, Leighton Ford, a Christian leader originally from Ontario, I was actually born in Toronto, invited me to join him on a pilgrimage to the holy places of Ireland. I've never been to Ireland. It wasn't the old country for me. I'm originally from Japan. And we ended up visiting some of the ancient monasteries of Ireland and learned from the monks about this way of life that they described as a rule of life that enabled them to experience God as alive and real, not just as they were praying in a monastery, but as they were working out in a field, as they were studying in a library, as they were preparing a meal in a kitchen. And I was really hungry to experience God in every part of my life. And I hadn't been. I had just been way too busy. And so when I returned home, I began to put into practice some of these simple habits learned from the monks, what they describe as a rule of life. And this began to slowly change my life. And out of that, I wrote God in My Everything. And then eventually I wrote Survival Guide for the Soul. So, and as far as Survival Guide for the Soul goes, a lot of us Christians at Bayview Glen or wherever would say, I think we would say, we believe that God loves us, but we determine our self-worth, our actual value based on what we accomplish and how others view us or how we think others view us. And so I wanted to explore what it would be like to pursue a life of contribution, but not one that is driven by this anxious need to prove that we are enough, as I spoke about in one of the sermons, but that comes from a deep sense of gratitude and inner rest that flows from knowing that we're already accepted, in fact, cherished by the one who matters most.
Awesome. Yeah, so you're basically saying like, I guess in our culture, there's so much emphasis on your work. Your worth is in your work. So when you meet someone, it's like, what do you do for a living? That's the first thing you ask someone. What do you do? Like, there's so much worth in our work. But I guess like what you're kind of saying is it's actually flipped around. It's more about our being. It's about you do who you are. And it's like, who are you? Going back to that identity piece, like your identity as a beloved child or daughter, or son or daughter of God. Is that right? Or?
Yeah, and in Survival Guide for the Soul, I cite this Jewish biblical scholar named Joseph Solzhenitsyn. And he points out as he reads the book of Genesis that in Genesis 1, we seem to have one portrayal of Adam, but in Genesis chapter 2, there's a different way that Adam is featured. And so Solzhenitsyn points out that in Genesis 1, Adam is called to fill the earth and subdue it. And I call this Adam striving Adam. So striving Adam wants to create businesses in the GTA or wherever. Striving Adam wants to be the one who comes up with the COVID vaccine. Striving Adam wants to control the world. We need striving Adam. But then in Genesis 2, we seem to meet a different side of Adam, whom I call soulful Adam. This Adam is walking in the garden with God. This Adam is lonely until Eve appears. This Adam yearns for connection with God and others. And I believe that we need both striving Adam to get things done, but also this soulful Adam that connects with God, our souls, one another. And our culture, and this is especially true, I think, in the GTA, it's also true in Vancouver, puts the spotlight on striving Adam. And so if you don't take a Sabbath, you don't rest, you might well get promoted, but it is deleterious for our soul. It undermines the most essential part of who we are. And so Survival Guide for the Soul is a meditation on the practices that awaken us to the things that make us alive in God and with each other, that make us feel deeply loved.
That's cool. Ken, you talked about this rule of life as kind of a process. Talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about like how long did that process go? Because I mean, in your book, God in My Everything, I mean, you actually give the illustration of a trellis. It's a very well developed form, I guess is maybe the best way to look at it. So yeah, talk to me about how long that kind of took you to develop your own rule of life, and who were some of the people along the way? You talked about Leighton Ford as a mentor, but I'm assuming that there were some other people too that came alongside you and helped keep you accountable on some levels to your rule of life as well.
Yeah, so Dave, great question. Let me just backtrack a little bit. You've read God in My Everything, and so you're familiar with the idea of trellis. But if you are not familiar with the idea of trellis, let me just give you a bit of background. So, when I mentioned the term rule of life, that scares some people. Some people by temperament don't like the word rule. But one of the original root meanings of the word rule is trellis. And I actually have this here in my office in Vancouver. A trellis is simply a support structure that sits under a grapevine. And you'll know this if you've been to a vineyard, say in the Niagara region of Ontario, or the Okanagan of BC, or the Napa Valley of California. And so a trellis supports a grapevine, enabling it to receive more sunlight, to be pruned and guided in its growth so that it produces better grapes and therefore better wine. And a rule of life is really a way of life, a rhythm of life that acts like a trellis, supporting our life with God so that we experience more of the sunlight of Jesus Christ in our life, so to speak, so that our lives can be pruned and simplified and guided, so that we bear more of the fruit of Jesus's character, more of his love, joy, and peace. And I desperately need more of that. And perhaps our friends at Bayview Glen, our community there, longs for this as well. And so in terms of how long did it take me to develop my rule of life? Well, it's been ongoing since Ireland, and it's constantly in a process of development and evolution. And during the pandemic, it's changed as well. And so it's really important. One of the best lessons I learned about a rule of life came from a guy named James Bryan Smith, who writes about the good and beautiful life in some of his books. But he says that if you create a rule of life and then your life starts to feel like heavier, so folks read, Survival Guide for the Soul, or, God in My Everything, if you've got in hand, and they're inspired to create practices, but their life feels heavier. It's probably a sign that their routine is self-initiated, self-created, rather than spirit-inspired. Because if it's spirit-inspired, it's not going to feel like, oh, my life is so heavy. It's going to feel like, oh, my life feels supported. It feels lighter and freer. And so what I would recommend is simply start with one practice. I list some practices in the books, and one that connects you to God, and then maybe in time, one that really fills you up, and just be gentle with yourself. And, the idea is not to create some kind of, fancy trellis. It's to create a structure, a rhythm that actually supports your life with God. And it's important to be flexible and gentle with yourself in an experimental mode to see what really brings you closer to God and what enlivens you. So
that's interesting, because a lot of times when we think of the word rule, we think of something that's static, right? It doesn't change. It's when we think about the laws of our land and the rules that we live our lives by and all that kind of stuff. But what you're saying, and I loved how you preface that, if it's something that's of our own creation that weighs us down, it's maybe not something. It's not something that's going to be helpful for us. We need to be going. We actually have a practice that we talk about at Bayview Glen. One of our gospel practices. It's called discovering a life connected to God and others. And so, that process of discovery is really this process of building this trellis as we discover what it means to be in relationship with God and allow Him to speak and to inform our practices. Those are the things that are going to be life-giving. Instead of you probably, I don't know, in Sunday school, we always sang the song, read your Bible, pray every day, and you'll grow, grow, grow. And for me, as a child growing up and understanding that, I know there was a time in my life where having to do that all the time was like, it did weigh me down. It was something that I really got discouraged in my practice. and you know, it left me dry. I started to look for other spiritual practices that were life-giving. Talk to me a little bit about, you know, the people that helped you, you know, either stay accountable to your rule or helped you discern in your life what some of these practices that you were going to work into your rule of life were.
A couple of people come to mind. A friend of mine named Jeff has a kind of prophetic gift. And he once said, I think God has a word for you. And my ears perked up. And he said, you know, for a long time, you felt like you needed to be the guy. When you were younger, you felt like you needed to be the guy on the sports field. And then you felt like you needed to be the guy in the corporate world. And even now, you feel like you need to be the guy as the pastor. Jeff said, here's what I sense God is saying to you. You don't need to be the guy. You just need to be the son. And tears came to my eyes. It just took me totally off guard. And I think it's been really helpful for me to understand that these practices aren't ways to gain favor with God, but they're simply ways to enjoy God's presence and his delight. And so that was really helpful to take the performance aspect out of it. And then more recently, during COVID, I've been connecting with a friend of mine named Mark, and he lives in a different Canadian city, and so we connect by Zoom. And so this may sound really intense and negative, but we take time to share our struggles and temptations, whether struggle with prayer or temptation to maybe view something that I shouldn't, or temptation to maybe compare and envy. I'm a very competitive person, and there's something about that simple voluntary act of sharing my struggle, the temptation, the areas I fail, that is really freeing. And when Mark says, I'm not ashamed of you or whatever, it lifts the toxic shame, but also in a positive way, because I anticipate this time of confession coming up weekly. It prevents me from making some bad decisions that I might otherwise make. It doesn't always do it, but it does have a kind of a mitigating factor. And so there is something really powerful and beautiful about being able to be your real self before a trusted brother or sister, and then praying. And so that's been really life-giving, especially in a time where I think a lot of us are tempted to isolate, and in some cases we need to, socially distance, but to lean out of community. So it's awesome what you and Mike are doing as you encourage people, even during these strange times, to be leaning in to community and into relationship.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. Just as you're talking about, I think especially in the church, there's like this expectation that gets put on leaders, not just pastors, but like just church leaders, even some of the expectations we might have of like our small group leaders or our life group leaders, just like even like teachers or whatever. It's this expectation of like, you need to have everything together. You need to have like your whole life together. You need to have every I dotted and every T crossed. You need to know the answer for everything. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing like leadership is very lonely, and to have someone to open up to have someone to be vulnerable and to be able to receive the love of Christ from someone is like just so freeing, especially I think for us as leaders, so that really just resonates with me as you're saying that. Like, we need those kind of spaces to be vulnerable, because like, and maybe I'm just speaking for like, millennials or whatever you want to call them, but I think vulnerability in leadership is something that is so needed and so powerful, and yet is missing from a lot of leadership that we see today, not even just in the church, but like just in general.
Yeah, it was very much like when you were talking about, Ken, the need to be the guy. Sometimes we see leaders as these isolated people on top of the mountain that are pulling people up, exactly. And I loved it that that you shared with what you shared with us was basically, sometimes I think also too when it comes to our spiritual practices, we think that those are isolated to our closet. We practice those in solitude, not with other people. But what you're demonstrating as a leader is like, no, I'm not the guy. I'm a fellow traveler with you. You're inviting people into your life to help you, to keep you accountable to the life that God has called you to live. And not just keep you accountable in a negative sense, but to keep you accountable in a way that gives you life. And I love that you've been able to find some people along the way that have been able to come around you and help you and to continue to grow and to develop into the man that God has called and created you to be. So it's been awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that stuff with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking.
Let's shift gears a bit, okay? Yeah. So we're talking, so Ken, you recently came to preach a series for us based off of survival habits of the soul, right? And in that series, you gave us 3 practices or habits that you've incorporated into your life and that you encourage us to incorporate as well, right? And those practices were meditation, prayer of examine, and Sabbath, right? Am I correct?
Good memory, Mike.
I'm trying. How have you seen those habits kind of play out in your life? And I guess like what are some of the, what would be some of the advice you would give for us as we kind of navigate how to incorporate these into our lives as well?
Yeah. So yesterday I got a little gift from my wife. It's a little special occasion, and usually when she asks me if I want a gift, I say I'm good. But I was thinking about it, and I lost my fins, my swim fins, and some years ago, because I've got weak ankles from basketball injuries that occurred years ago, torn ligaments. I started using fins in the pool to strengthen my ankles. And it's a little bit of a metaphor. If there are areas that you want to grow in, then consider a spiritual practice that might address that. And so for me, as I mentioned in one of the sermons, I'm a very easily distracted kind of person. At any given time, I can feel like there are 141 monkeys jumping around in my head. And so this practice of meditation, of breathing deeply, exhaling slowly, using, I've got it here somewhere, this app called Centering Prayer, just so I'm not thinking about the time, really helps. And meditation has been a struggle for me. There's a bell that suggests I'm in a kind of monastery, even though I'm in my house or in my office, summoning me to pray. But it has also been so life-giving. Naturally, I can be stressed or agitated, but this practice across the months and years has enabled me to be much more in the room with a person, as others have said, and just less sort of fidgety and more conscious of God's presence and love. So it's been powerfully life-changing. And then the gratitude practice. During the pandemic, there have been some mornings when I've woken up feeling melancholy, a little depressed. I feel weighted down because someone in our community has contracted COVID. There was a woman in our community, a mother of young daughters, who was on a ventilator. She's pulled through now. Other people, have lost their jobs. And there are times when I felt really weighted down. And so this gratitude practice has been really important for me in the morning. I'll go for a run and I'll look back over the day and I'll thank God for the good meal, the chance to go swimming the day before, a meaningful conversation. And then what I'll do is, as I continue to run, I will bring to mind the faces of people like my wife, our son, my mentor, Leighton Ford, and others who have really reflected God's love to me. And as I thank God for them, it lifts me up. And so that's been a really joy evoking practice. And then the third practice of Sabbath, we were talking, can I mention what we were saying about Lucas? I don't know if folks know he's in Arizona. Can I mention this or not? A well-deserved break there. And you were joking, sort of part serious, that he's Sabbathing by the pool somewhere in the heat. And we can actually get away to Arizona. I guess we have to quarantine when we come back, and we can be lying by the pool and trying to relax. But after 5 minutes, some of us start to think of all the things we ought to be doing, our to-do list, and we feel like such a bum. And Sabbath actually takes practice to learn how to rest, how to let go. And when you practice Sabbath, as Walter Brueggemann says, the great Old Testament scholar, when you practice Sabbath once a week, you experience the other 6 days of the week differently. And so you can actually dial down during the week as well, even as you work really hard. And so, these have been a lifeline for me. I don't see my rule of life, my trellis, as a have to, but as a get to. It feels like pure gifts. So.
Thanks for joining us for part 1 of our conversation with Pastor Ken Shigematsu. We hope you join us for part 2 as we continue our discussion with him about spiritual habits and practices of the soul. And so we'll see you next time.